Ethics in research are really important and they can't be dismissed. Really what we're looking at is trying to decide what is morally proper or improper, not just when we're working with the participants so that they're all treated fairly and they're not harmed in any way, but also with secondary data. Now, secondary data is when you use data that you're collecting after the fact. For example, you could be gathering treatment records from a facility, or you could be looking at test scores or um, anything like that about students. And if they're not kept private and protected, it could still affect the subject. So secondary data is important also. And we have the bottom line is that the primary researcher is that person has the responsibility to protect the subjects, to make sure that they're safe from harms or risks and that they're treated with respect. Now, sadly, this becomes important because of some of the history and some of the abuse that's been done in the name of research. We can think back to some of the research projects that were done in Nazi Germany, the Nuremberg trials, the Tuskegee syphilis study, where men were actually treatment for syphilis was withheld from men to see what would happen as the disease progressed. And this is especially sad because penicillin became widely available during this time, and yet in the name of research, these men suffered really badly. There's been research done during bomb testing within our own geographic region of the world, and there's a lot of controversy about information that may have been withheld from people. Some of you may recall the Stanford prison study where participants took on the roles of jailers and prisoners, and some of the actions became very abusive, and yet it was allowed to continue. Even today, as I'm recording this lecture, the APA, the American Psychological Association, is embroiled in some real bitter discussions about how those with some specialized psychology background have used that in some interrogations for terrorism prisoners. And there's a huge battle going on, an ethics battle going on right now within the APA. So, of course, legislation becomes important. The National Research Act of 1975 addressed a lot of this. And the bottom line of that research is twofold. First of all, subjects have to be protected. They have to be protected from harm or risk of any kind, and the benefits have to far outweigh the risks or any harm. And the part of the protection of the subjects is that they have to be informed and give consent, participate of their own free will, if you will, and they have to know what's going to happen before they are involved in a study. The second piece that was important in the NRA was that any research subject had to be, any research proposal has to be reviewed by an authorized group. And this turned into what we call the Internal Review Boards and Committees on Human Subjects, which you probably know by the acronym IRB. And this process is designed to protect the subjects, and it's also designed to protect the institution from any liability if someone is harmed. A lot of you are teachers, so I would hope that you're familiar with the Family Education Rights and Privacy Act of 1974. This is really important in educational research because we have the mandate to protect privacy. A teacher, for example, cannot just access information about any student they want to. A teacher has to get permission and have a reason, even to gather up de-identified data, which would be data where all of the identifying pieces have been taken out of it. The equivalent to this is the HIPAA on the medical side, if you're working in medical research at all. The Belmont Report is very important to the research committee. This actually came from within the research committee, and it laid out 3 principles that should govern any research that's done on human subjects. First of all, there's the principle of beneficence. This means that you have to do an analysis of the cost versus the benefits, or the risks versus the benefits. And that has to be clearly spelled out before you undertake any research. Secondly is the principle of justice, and that means that there has to be equal access, that it has to be fair, that people have to be debriefed or treated afterwards if there is a way to help them. And the third principle is respect, which means that we treat subjects with dignity and we treat them humanely. They are not lab rats, and that's clearly spelled out in the Belmont Report. And as a result of these pieces of legislation and internal principles such as the Belmont Report, it's much more common these days that studies have actually been stopped when the benefits became so obvious that it was no longer ethical to continue withholding treatment from, for example, a control group. So we are seeing improvements made over the last several decades. When we're working with educational research, there's three principles that really stand out from all of what I've discussed here. First of all, there is the principle of informed consent. This means that the subjects have to know what's going to happen, what the risks are, what the benefits are, and then they make a decision whether or not they will participate, and they can actually withdraw when they want to. Now, there's a difference between consent and assent. Consent, especially with children, is when an adult knowingly gives permission for something to happen, and that's what we must have when we're working with students in a K-12 setting. Their parents must sign off and give either active or passive consent depending on what's approved by the IRB and what the designs of the project involve. Assent is when a child is under 18 but cognitively capable. They also have the right to say yes or no, and this can be really frustrating if you've got a group of kids in a classroom and you'd like to do an intervention in the classroom, and of course the most popular kid in the class says, no, I don't want to participate, and then they, peer pressure kicks in, and it can be very frustrating, but it's also very real. The last principle is the one of privacy. We have the responsibility to keep records confidential, to allow for anonymity if at all possible, and then to keep the records stored very carefully. Confidentiality and anonymity are very different. Confidentiality is when you can identify the people who are responding or participating as the researcher, and you have to be sure to code things or use some kind of scheme so that people are not identified when you write up your results, and you keep everything confidential, even though you as the researcher may have a way to link someone to a particular piece of data. Anonymity, though, is totally different. That is when you design your study or your instruments so that you as a researcher have no way or very little way of knowing who has responded. Right now I'm gathering data within the school district for a study that we're doing, and it is totally anonymous. The students are responding, but we know nothing about them other than their gender and the grade level they are in. And that's totally anonymous. I have no way in that data of connecting a data point to any particular student in the district. And then finally, data has to be stored and kept for a certain length of time, depending on the type of study that you're doing, so that it can always go back and be checked, or if there is any harm comes to a subject, you can go back and try to find out where that came from and what happened. Now, your textbook does a really good job of discussing whether or not you can withhold information from subjects. And this can get really sticky because you could have a design that would be totally invalid, that it would be of no use to the world if the subjects actually knew what they were being studied for. For example, if you were working with a drug that was supposed to help ADHD students with behaviors in class, and you tell them that that's what the drug's for, then it could influence the data that you collect. However, you may need to deceive them, at least while the study is going on, and tell the students that it's something to do with their health or something like that, so that they don't purposely change their behavior because they know that they're in this study. Now, the important thing there, when you do have to deceive participants, and this should all be approved by a review board and discussed, and you may have to adjust and change, but it's important to debrief the subjects afterwards and let them know what really happened and what they participated in. There was an obedience study done ages ago where people were administering electric shocks, or they thought they were administering electrical shocks to people they could see behind a window when the people answered incorrectly. And someone in a lab coat was telling them, go ahead, administer the shock. And it was called the obedience study. The problem there was that some people thought they were administering shocks that were strong enough to kill people. And they, even with the debriefing, they ended up with a lot of emotional baggage from participating in this study. And those are the sorts of horrible things that we want to avoid. We don't want to move forward in the world of research and solving problems in the world on harming people or making their lives worse in any way. This concludes part 3, so you are now ready to do your response activity, which actually involves ethics, and I hope that we see a really good discussion ensuing in Web Campus.